bottom end of the graph, you see quite a lot of sort of deep red, and that the cheaper production, you see an awful lot of that comes from Middle East. Now, this chart is extremely important to understand the dynamics of the world oil market. Okay, so these, as I've said, are known as the break-even points. Okay, now what these break-even points include is not pure cost. According to whose methodology you're following, but the customary methodology includes profit, and it also includes discounted rate of return from future production. So what this chart shows is basically the break-even points for the production of oil at normal rates of profit. Okay, which in the industry are often seen as 15–20%. That's a normal rate of profit for oil production companies. Okay, next please. This is the same data basically, but slightly more abstractly put and maybe a bit clearer. So you can see they've split it into segments, the grey chunks. So the cheaper producers are mostly in the Middle East. Then you have conventional onshore oil production, and the cost of production there ranges from about $30 up to just over $60 a barrel. And then you have three incoming categories of production: shale oil production going off the shore into deep water production, and the tar sands, mostly in Canada and North America. And you can see that they're all more at the higher cost end of production. And also on this graph, you can see across the horizontal axis how much production of any given category of supply. And what you can see there, it's at 90. In fact, the current production is more like 100. This is slightly out of date. I mean, oil production has been increasing at about 1 million barrels of oil a day. So, 5 years down the line, we're very close to 100. Okay, but you get the basic idea, I hope. This is a really important point to understand the dynamics of the oil industry. Okay, next please. Okay, that was part one. This is part two. We're going to go a bit more deeply into the theory of this. I hope you don't mind all these graphs. I mean, I'll explain this one quite a bit. I mean, the thing about Marx is that he doesn't only explain the labor theory of value, he also explains how the labor theory of value actually appears in capitalist commodity production. And the sector where this is, his explanation is actually the most advanced and also complicated is in agriculture. And what Marx does is he tries to explain how comes in agriculture you can have landlords making private property income from rent, as well as capitalists making profit. And he basically has a labor theory of rent. And so both the landlord's rent and the capitalist profit come from surplus value produced by the workers. And his theory of rent actually distinguishes between three different subcategories of rent, or dimensions of rent, if you like. And so if you look at this graph, he's saying the AR is absolute rent and the DR is differential rent. Okay, now absolute rent is just the cost you have to pay the landlord for using their land. It's a pure monopoly rent, if you like. The differential rent increases as the fertility of the soil increases. Okay, so for example, if you can only produce 1 unit for a given expenditure, which is the case in A, then your cost of production will be higher and there's no surplus profit for rent. And as the fertility of the soil increases on different plots of land, so your cost of production will decrease and there will be an increasing potential for a differential rent. So in other words, what Marx is getting at is how in a capitalist system, the greater fertility which comes from nature is converted and becomes, through the agency of labor and then the capital, becomes a rent for the landowner. It's quite a complex chain of reasoning, but I mean, I hope intuitively you can get the idea that as capitalist farmers work on more fertile lands, they can produce their products more cheaply, but they can sell them at the same market price as everybody else. So there's a bigger differential. Who captures that differential? Marx says in the end, the landlord gets it. Okay, next, please. All right. This slide is perhaps the most dense theoretically of everything I want to say today. People have been arguing about this for over 150 years, so I'm not really going to sort it out in a minute or two, but just to give you a flavor of what's involved here, right? Marx's theory of rent comes towards the end of the third volume of his 3 volumes of Das Kapital. In other words, it's about 2,000 pages in that he comes to his theory of rent, okay? But conceptually, so not a lot of people get there, but I'll try and just summarize conceptually what it's based on, okay? The volume 3 of Capital is different to volume 1 and volume 2. Volume 1 looks at capitalist commodity production, and it establishes the foundations of it, that the essence of value is socially necessary labor time. In volume 2, Marx looks at capital circulating as capital, and in volume 3, he brings the two together. Now, this is so important because what he's actually explaining is how the essence of the capitalist relations actually appear in reality. And their appearance in reality distorts and hides their essence. That's a major point he makes, okay? Now, the form that this takes is that the value of the commodity does not appear as such, but appears as its price of production, okay? So surplus value does not appear as surplus value, it becomes profit. And the profit is realized according to the amount of capital invested rather than the labor appropriated. So Marx looks at a system of industrial capitals for which he assumes that the total surplus value will equal the total profit, but the fragmentation of that surplus value will be different according to the size of the individual capital, okay? That's his basic idea of prices of production. And so what you have is those sectors which have a relatively high technology content and relatively fewer workforce will have a higher price of production than their simple value. So the price of production is the cost price of the commodity plus the average profit times the amount of capital that's been invested, okay? Now, this seems very technical, but actually it's very close to how capitalists see the system working for themselves. They look at cost and profit, and they'll set their prices according to cost plus basically, if you like, a markup on the profit, okay? Now, Marx himself made further modifications to this idea of price of production, and which is what the rest of volume 3 is about. And what he does is he modifies it further to take into account not just industrial capital, but other fractions of capital and land ownership as well. Now, Marx misses something. It's not, I don't know if you can see the bottom of this slide. There's just one line at the bottom of the slide. It might just be mine. I'll have to do my slides differently. I don't know if we can pick it up. Just at the bottom of the slide, there's a second further modification, which Marx actually missed, although it's there in the premises of his argument, which is that price of production needs to be also varied according to variations in the rate of surplus value, okay, which is the question of labor superexploitation, which he does not directly address. Okay, next slide. So why is the cotton mill next to a lake or a little pond, okay, at top left, right? The first mills were actually located next to rivers. And the reason was because they needed the water to turn the water wheels. So the bottom picture is of a water wheel in a cotton mill, a silk mill actually, I think in that case. And before steam, basically the motive power for the mills came from harnessing the flow of the water from the river. So the water wheel acted as the motive energy for all. There's loads of pulleys, belts, levers, etc., to spread the potential, the kinetic energy rather, from the water into the motion of the machines. This enhanced the labor productivity of the workers concerned. The more energy you could put into the machines from the water, the quicker they would work, the more the workers would be producing. And this allowed those capitalists which have access to this extra energy to reduce the individual price of production of the commodities their workers were producing, right? Which meant that they were cheaper, which meant that they could make a profit over and above the average profit, a surplus profit. So Marx introduces the idea of labor productivity as being the source of the surplus product, an enhanced labor productivity. So he's making he's retaining the labor theory of value and explaining how it can lead to forms of surplus profit as well as ordinary profit. Now the question is, who gets the surplus profit? Next slide. Well, Marx applied this to capitalist agriculture, and he did see capitalist agriculture in England as being the classic case. In other words, it was a three-class system. The active capitalist was only a tenant farmer. They had to rent on a lease their land from a landowner. At that time, it was only annual leases, by the way. And of course, there were the agricultural workers producing on the land itself. So what Marx is basically saying is that the surplus value which the agricultural workers produced was split between two classes. The first being the capitalist farmer, and the which should be a ... there, my mistake, the landowner. Okay, so the more fertile the soil, the more productive the labor, the greater the surplus profit. Now, if the landowner can force the tenant farmer off the land, if they don't forfeit that surplus profit as rent, they will capture it. So you have the workers producing the surplus profit, the capitalist being the first sort of vehicle for it, and there being a potential for that to them having to surrender it in the form of a higher rent to the landlord. Okay, next. Marx also talks, as well as the sort of natural fertility of the soil and so on, he also brings in that capital is an active agent in this process. So capital can invest in buildings, in fertilizer, which obviously get mixed with the natural properties of the soil. But that action by capital can also increase the productivity which can be gained from the soil. And that means in turn that you can increase the surplus profit and indeed increase the rent. So for Marx, the landlord captures rent because of the monopoly of private ownership of the land. Okay, so there's two levels of monopoly in Marx's conception. One is the monopoly of the means of production overall by the capital overall. But in addition to that, there's a particular monopoly, which is private ownership of the land. Next. Okay, you may not follow all of this, but I'll just summarize it. Basically, Marx posits that you have four different capitalist farmers on four different plots of land, A, B, C, and D. And B is twice as productive as A, C is more productive again, and D is even more productive. So for the same expenditure, which would be 50 shillings, on land A, you can grow 1/4 of wheat. On land B, you can grow 2/4 of wheat. On land C, you can grow 3/4 of wheat. On a land D, 4/4 of wheat. Okay, so the overall investment is 200 shillings. And if we go across to the right, you can see that the capitalist farm